Thank you so much. Make sure this is working. Thank you so much, Alex, for that very generous introduction. And I'm so happy to be with all of you today in person. I think it's my first in-person lecture. So it's in about 2-3 years. I also thank Alex, Leon, and, Paul, everyone that has made this possible to be here in present, and also the members of the Environmental Humanities and Hoke Lecture Series program for this invitation to share my work. And I'll just begin and hopefully we'll stay on time. So on December 29th, 2021, photographs of pages from the Sri Lankan Army's 2022 diary calendar circulated on social media. Each month of the year staged a photograph of Sri Lanka's armed forces interacting with civilians. In one image, a soldier is driving the lorry of a paddy farmer who props up his feet and is resting on his bags of harvested rice. Ironically, this image is paired with the month of April. We're in April right now, so it's fitting. The same month last year that the now ousted former president Gotabaya Rajapaksa halted the importation of all chemical fertilizers for Sri Lanka's farmers. His decision and so many others in a longue durée of overspending, corruption, and authoritarian violence plummeted the country's farmers and 22 million civilians into what is now being called the country's most severe economic crisis. And the staged photograph accompanying the month of July, however, made me pause more because it featured the resemblance of a community with whom I've been doing research with for the past 14 years. In the image, 7 barefoot women are dressed up as tea plantation pluckers, and they are staged on a mountainous hillside surrounded by tea bushes. In the foreground, 4 woven baskets sit upright with various amounts of plucked tea leaves in them. The bodily stances of 4 of the women are familiar to anyone who has spent time in Sri Lanka's tea growing areas. They are on a break from their plucking work, and each of the 4 women are engaged in an act of eating or feeding. 2 direct their right hands towards their mouths, their fingers presumably holding molded balls of rice and curry that they have just finished cooking on the smoking spot that is sitting in a firewood hearth in the shot's foreground. Another woman has finished her meal. She rests her hand on her plate, which is balancing on the rock surface, and takes up a cup of tea to her lips with her left hand. The last woman sits on what appears to be a wooden bench for 2 and seems to also have finished her meal. With her right leg slightly propping up her right hand, she appears to be peeling paku or areca nut, and to assemble it with some betel leaf or vettele, tobacco leaf poile, and sunam, limestone paste for an after meal chew. This is a very common thing to chew during work. The other 3 women are feeding. Their bodies are positioned towards 3 human-like figures, presumably armed soldiers, each covered in leaves bearing leafy-covered rifles. The women appear to be offering the leafy soldiers cups of plain tea, food by the hand, and small talk with inviting mouths. The image captioned in Sinhala right below, English and Tamil script right below, reads in English as follows. Quote, set down the bag, put down the gun, the creed, the past, the caste, in a moment took where time stood still with their arduous tasks, end quote. So if speaking with Tamil women on Sri Lanka's tea estates about their lives and worlds of work has taught me anything, it is that time has never stood still. The Sri Lankan state has never put down its guns, its attention to caste, its past, and its bloodlines. And for 200 years, plantation workers have labored without a living wage and within state-sponsored systems of caste oppression, patriarchy, and industrial exploitation that are sustained by socioeconomic and cultural relationships of debt and desire. Desire for tea at the expense of unpayable debts. So just days before the Army's calendar images circulated in 2021, the Ministry of Plantation Industries announced that it had signed a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Industries, Mine, and Trade of the Islamic Republic of Iran to settle a $251 million outstanding debt of the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation with the National Iranian Oil Company. The settlement outlined that Sri Lanka would begin sending Iran $5 million worth of tea each month to repay the country's oil purchases pending from 4 years prior. It would be one of the many last chance efforts of the now former Rajapaksa regime to alleviate the country's insurmountable foreign debt, conserve the last of its dollars, and prevent further damage to its international lending relationships. Now, nearly 1.5 years later, we now have hindsight that this agreement, a new president, and a recently inked $3 billion IMF loan have not been able to effectively stave off the economic hardships that civilians are experiencing. 7 months after the Tea for Oil MOU and the Army calendar's debut, a video circulated on social media in August 2022 of 3 Tamil tea estate residents being swept away by floods on Katabula estate outside the hill station town of Navalapitiya, which is close to where I do field research. The first resident to fall into the water was a mother of 3. She was trying to cross a flooded river by rope while returning from work. The other 2 residents, both fathers of 3 children, tried to save her and were also swept away. Katabula Estate, just to give you a sense, there's a large waterfall near there, is part of Kavata Plantations, a company that dominates the current price rankings of tea in the district, has won a gold award for specialty tea in China, and holds a number of sustainability certifications. So how did Sri Lanka's Tamil tea estate workers, a majority of whom are landless, caste oppressed, once made stateless the year after independence, get entered without consent into a transnational agreement that dictates they pluck $5 million worth of tea monthly to repay the country's debt? How did they get entered into this agreement for the next 4 years while not being provided a single day's safe foot passage to those sustainability certified, award-winning tea fields on which they are required to carry out their waged work? If I were to rewrite the captions from the Army's photograph, it might read as follows, quote, "The bag, the gun, the creed, the past, and caste have taken the time of the women on this mountain, the women who have stood by and served the nation for which they pluck." In 2018, Hanusha Somasundaram, a hill country Tamil artist and teacher from the plantation areas, told me, "Our tea, this Ceylon tea, everyone around the world knows, but when they drink our tea, they do not know who made it. And yet here she is. The taste of Ceylon tea is not human." Her words have stayed with me since then. Through a pandemic when striking plantation workers were jailed without bail for demanding their back pay from management and without the help of their patron-bound union leaders, and now in the last year through the now suppressed People's Struggles movement in Sri Lanka. They particularly stay with me at this very moment in the crisis when 8 in 10 Sri Lankan households are cutting down the number of meals that they eat each day. To celebrate Ceylon tea, to promote the desire for its taste, scent, and dust, the Sri Lankan state purposefully commits to orchestrating what the late philosopher Lauren Berlant calls slow death. They love the power they hold to destroy someone and something in return for, in Berlant's words, quote, "scandals of the appetite," without talking about the temporality of the workday, the debt cycle, consumer practice, and fantasy, end quote. So since 2019, I have been tracking these tea scandals in film, Indo-Lankan relations, and transitional justice programs for hill country Tamils living on, but also beyond Sri Lanka's tea and rubber plantations, but only to find that they have not evaded the talk of everyday workday temporalities or consumptive debt and desire, but rather debt and fantasy are all they can talk about. And they are all I hear and everywhere I look. And that's what I want to share with you today. Debt and fantasy rise from the hills of the Army's July calendar with what Black Studies visual scholar Tina Campt calls haptic temporalities. If you watch this feasting scene closely, you can hear the state's choreographed flexes of domination and subordination in the small talk being exchanged between the soldiers and working women. You can consume this fictional reproduction of the state's ultimate fantasy, where a leafy, fully camouflaged, armed Singhala man can command the attention and resources and time of a bare-legged, sari-clad, minority Tamil woman worker and stand still with her in consensual pleasure. But because of what I know of the plantation's global histories of sexual violence and ethno-nationalist policing, of tea in line, patra lines, and rooms in lines, all groomed by descent, caste, and capital, it is hard to not unsee the specter of terror and death here lurking in the shadows of their leafy rifles. The act of feasting tries desperately to hold up the sensation of what Berlant calls floating sideways. To follow food studies scholar Kyla Wazana Tompkins' reading of Berlant's slow death here, the act of eating is not necessarily about nourishment or for yourself or the motions of the act itself, but more in this image about how the act suspends time and creates a temporary disuse of the body through the consumptive gesture. If we were to work with this idea while looking at this image, we can see how the state's power grows through the act of eating during time stood still, how it balances delicately and coalesces in the women's full fingers and inviting mouths, what Portuguese artist and scholar Grada Quilomba has called the organ of oppression par excellence. Quote. But rather than say something new, these fantasies mirror scenes Sri Lankans and perhaps some of you have seen again and again. They were shot on another hillside for another vista and in another time stood still of Sri Lanka's past. So in the time that we have remaining, I want to respond to the Army's feasting scene with a brief presentation of the lesser known scripts and scenes that came before it, namely in select Hollywood films that were shot on location in and around Sri Lanka's tea plantations between 1934 and 1983. This 50-year time period, we'll make sure this works. Interesting. Oh, not sure what happened here. I think it signed out maybe. Let's see. Okay, that worked. I'm not sure if it signed out as Zoom though. So in the time that we have, I want to respond to, so I just want to take you through the 50-year time period. So this time period coincides with the tea industry's heyday, the years leading up to following Ceylon's 1947 independence, and tea plantations workers' 1948 disenfranchisement based on their ancestral origins in India, which is right above, before their migration to colonial Ceylon, and 50 years before Sri Lanka's civil war, which ended in 2009 and began in 1983. Following these cinematic forms as they engage the country's plantation labor histories, what follows is a small excerpt of a larger work that I'm working on that studies the linkage between the cinematic afterlives of Sri Lanka's plantations and ongoing industrial forms of exploitation, caste oppression, and state-sponsored authoritarianism. So each scene I will present here today involves feasting or some kind of eating, feeding, or gesture. So it's fitting that you're eating of consumption. And each features Sri Lanka's plantation infrastructures, labor histories, and built environments in ways that bring out the present conditions and speculative futures of Sri Lanka's known trajectories of ethno-nationalist violence and unresolved demands from plantation workers for economic justice. So in doing so, I want to demonstrate how these scenes that were shot on an island extend to what art historian Anna Arabinden-Kesson, Claire Kobold, and Jarvis McInnes, and Jessica Womack have called the visual vocabulary of plantations and their afterlives. These scenes allow us to see how Sri Lanka's vernacular circuits of ethno-nationalist politics and racial capitalism extend beyond the island shores, as evident with the more slippery tea for oil barter agreement between Sri Lanka and Iran. So what might it mean to trace debts that are unpayable because of the fantasies they uphold? What methods of speculation do we need to use in order to break up the more conditioned and manufactured ways of knowing plantations in the present? Here I also take cue from anthropologist Vanessa Agard-Jones to look at the material evidence on the ground that is often dispersed, but permanent. And as with the Sands knowledge of queerness in Martinique that she is tracking in her article, What Sands Remember, I think these feasting scenes similarly impart narratives that seem granular, disconnected, and even scattered at first. But when assembled together, and perhaps when you go home and think about it again and again, as I've been doing, they urge us to feel through touch, sound, and visual materiality, those temporalities and rootings of plantation labor histories in Sri Lanka as they currently stand against the current conditions of debt and fantasy of ethnonationalism. So let's begin. It's kind of our fun part. So, scene one. 1936, the exploitation film Jaws of the Jungle. It was shot on the island in 1934, the same year as the British documentary Song of Ceylon was released. And that was commissioned by the Tea Propaganda Board. So I like to think of Jaws of the Jungle, for those of you who watch Stranger Things, as the upside down world complement to Song of Ceylon. Whereas Song of Ceylon sticks closely to the depicting of vernacular grandeur, the voices of commerce on the island, under the gaze of Ceylon's elites, looking up to the horizon of independence and global market inclusion, Jaws of the Jungle flirts excessively with the chaotic narrative of ruined pre-colonial kingdoms, now in swampy and scattered ruins. Its villain protagonists are vampire bats. Well, let's go back. Vampire bats, shot up close in various formations of flight and terrorizing. They chase Ceylon's rural villagers and nearby tea plantation residents from their homes, displacing them to the dangers of the jungle. Scene two, 1952, The Planter's Wife, or known in the United States as Outpost in Malaya. Meant to be set in British Malaya, kind of common to Singapore and also Malaysia, the plot of the film tracks a rubber planter and his wife fighting off local communist militants. Before filming, director Ken Anakin recalls in his 2001 memoir that he and one of his cameramen, Peter Hennessy, had traveled to what is now Singapore to spend time with a tea planter, Angus Mackenzie. But when they arrived, they realized that the violence between Malay militants and planters was too risky, and they moved to shoot to Ceylon, or Sri Lanka. And for 8 weeks, they based up in a hotel in Colombo and traveled 2 hours back and forth each day to shoot in the rubber plantation areas of the island's southwest wet zones. In this scene, a woman worker is pleading for her life in Tamil when the superintendent and his overseer catch her leaving a kilogram of rice for one of the militant bandits who has threatened to cut her throat if she rats him out. And he pours the rice out. And in a later scene, another superintendent apprehends a man worker who is hiding tins of sardine in his sarong belt to give to the militants. And in the staff office, the superintendent remarks in this scene, "We can't blame these people for doing this sort of thing. They're being forced to it. But we can blame ourselves if we let any more food get out of here." And the film continues as the planter continues to defend his plantation grounds, his wife and son, and rubber and trees. And there's this kind of intense snake and mongoose scene that was shot as well. Scene 3, September 2019. It's not a film, but I am standing on a plot of land known as Hantana Tea Estate, located a few miles outside of Kandy Town in Sri Lanka's central province. I had visited the estate once in person in 2008 as I was beginning my dissertation research, and then again in 2019, and then again just this past month in February 2023. Hantana is the site of the Ceylon Tea Museum, which is housed in the old factory, and it's the only museum on the island dedicated to the industrial features of Ceylon tea production. So in 2008, back on Hantana, I was 2 months into my dissertation research and I knew nothing about this estate. Only later would I learn that I had seen this land before, not once, but more times than I could remember. Hantana had served as a location for 2 popular Hollywood films, Elephant Walk, which is here, and I used the old poster that we found in Sri Lanka last month. Elephant Walk from 1954 with Elizabeth Taylor and Peter Finch, and more famously, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which you now know because of the current Oscars show. So Elephant Walk, we'll start with. And this is Temple of Doom, and that's the poster from the film studio in Sri Lanka that I got last month. Elephant Walk is based on the 1948 novel by British writer and former planter in Ceylon and Malaya, Robert Standish. It was shot on for 4 weeks on Hantana and in other locations throughout the island in February 1953. The plot of the novel turned film is that John Wiley is the inheritor and descendant of his formidable tea planter father, Tom Wiley. He returns to Ceylon with his new bride, Ruth, played by Elizabeth Taylor. It was supposed to be Vivian Lee, but she was taken out of the film, to resume his duties as manager of Elephant Walk, a tea plantation whose bungalow and grounds his father deliberately carved into the migratory path of Ceylon's local elephants en route to their only water source. So the film perfectly captures what Black Studies scholar Clyde Woods has called the plantation block epistemology. As Ruth walks and John drive through it in a convertible through these plantation hills, Ruth laps up the landscape's beauty and industrial markings with her questions. She asks, "What's that building?" To which he responds, "That's my factory where we process the tea." To which she asks another question, "Are we on your plantation now?" To which he corrects her, "Our plantation, darling. We've been on it for about half an hour." "Half an hour," Ruth exclaims. "That's miles." "Yes, it is a few," he replies. Standish's novel, published in the same year Ceylon gained independence, basks in the whiteness of the British tea industry. But the film, shot 5 years later, reveals the subtle haptics of the newly independent country's Sinhala Buddhist nationalist projects. A stupa, the emblem of Sinhala Buddhist architecture, is kind of emerging from the lines of the Elephant Walk bungalow's roof, which doesn't make any sense actually, but it's fine. The head servant, Apuhami, featured here from the back, when Ruth admires his comb, describes his low country Sinhala comb of caste to her, which she doesn't really process, but it's fine. Dancers of the newly founded in the country, the Madhya Lanka Nritya Mandala, perform for white planters. This is a very famous Kandyan dance institute, and they had been newly founded about 10 years before the film was shot, in an extravagant performance on the estate's grounds. And in a later scene, Ruth steals a picturesque romantic getaway to the archaeological sites of Polonnaruwa. They go on horse, which doesn't make sense because it's quite far away, but it's fine. They go there where she and her love interest, another white planter, steal a kiss after taking in the sight of the sleeping Buddha and his disciple Ananda. 2 years following the film's release, the government of Sri Lanka would pass the Sinhala Only Act in 1956. An act that would remove Tamil and English from the national language registers, creating a whole host of kind of discriminatory acts to follow and experiences for minorities. 18 years later, Article 9 of the 1972 Constitution would give Buddhism a foremost place in the Democratic Republic, kind of higher than other religions being practiced, and the plantation's grounds would be nationalized and given over to the state. But rather than linger on these epic features, I look past them in the film scenes for plantation labor histories that I had come to know through research, and sure enough, they're there. Tamil plantation workers are everywhere in the film. They sing Tamil songs on the hills, they cook in the kitchen and prepare food in the courtyard of the bungalow, and they are the eyes, mouth, and ears of the industry, picking leaves, weighing them at the muster sheds, sorting and packing, and operating the humidifiers and rollers. When Ruth first arrives at the bungalow, shouts of "Vango, Vango," which is actually a Jaffna North Tamil dialect in Tamil, which means come, come. They burst out of the screen at the workers to fetch her luggage. And in a scene later shot on Hantana, planter John Wiley is on a horse and he speaks in this kind of broken, mispronounced Tamil while surrounded by Tamil pluckers who are assembling to work. And he climbs up onto his horse and then has a telling exchange with Edward, who's in the foreground right here in the hat, his Tamil Kangani or overseer. And he says, "Edward?" And Edward says, "Yes." He says, "Get as many pluckers as you can." And he says, "I'll make it for you, sir. Remember, we want a record year. We make, master. By the way, I heard you had a record year yourself. Triplets, huh?" "Yes, sir. 3 big boys." And then everyone laughs and stares up at John and his fellow white planters sitting up on their horses. And then the planter says, "You're quite a boy yourself," and then leans down and pats Edward on the shoulder while still on his horse. And as John rides away on his horse, His fellow planter goes with him, and Edward, the Kangani, shouts to his workers under him directly and frantically in Tamil. And he says in Tamil, Ingeva, Ingeva, Vango, Vango, Angaporinga, Ingeva, Ingeva, Angaporinga. These are like directives. And this translates to roughly, go there, come here, go there, go there. It's kind of frantic. It's all over the place. And then he's like, where are you going? And he's like, come here, go there. Right. So this kind of engaged these hypothetical scripts from Ingeva, which is actually a Kuli Tamil guide that was designed and translated throughout the British East India Company's plantations to teach planters how to command their laborers, and which I discussed in my book that Alex referenced in earlier work. And so the plot thickens when Elephant Walk and the surrounding areas are struck with an outbreak of cholera. The entire estate is quarantined, and at one point, John and his white assistant managers carry Tamil children in their hands from the workers' line rooms and place them in an outdoor camp enclosed by barbed wire. In the closing scenes, the elephants descend on Elephant Walk, destroying it in their path, and the bungalow is engulfed in flames. Ruth and John escape to the tea bushes and watch the bungalow burn. Ruth says, "I'm sorry," and John replies, "I'm not. Let them have their Elephant Walk. Ruth, we'll build a new place, a home somewhere else." And then they kiss in the rain, and the camera pans to an elephant trumpeting as the credits roll the end. So in December 2008, August 2019, and then again in February this year, I walked through the Ceylon Tea Museum on Hantana, viewing what very well could have been the roller machines of Elephant Walk's factory. The exterior of the bungalow, which was constructed, was no longer there, but the grounds still bear the signs of industry. Throughout the museum, archived sepia tone images of nameless hill country Tamil individuals are labeled as coolies and servants. And these photographs and illustrations hang on the walls for visitors to take in before they go up to the tea cafe on the top floor and drink their cup of tea. And as I roamed in 2008 through this gutted out factory turned cabinet of curiosity, the government of Sri Lanka was engaging in a brutal fight in the final 6 months of war with the Tamil militant group, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. Between January and May 2009, the internal displacement camp Menik Farms barbed wire enclosures would fill with thousands of displaced Tamils. And as I would later learn in my current research, the majority of the last individuals remaining in those camps were in fact families of hill country Tamils who claimed descendants and ties to the plantations. And having been displaced twice and thrice, they had no home or land to which they could return. 2 months later, in 1983, a local film crew, this is scene 4, final scene, was also clearing lands. But it wasn't here in Hantana, and it was in not only in northern province jungles, but also but back on Hantana. And so between April 18th and May 5th, 1983, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas shot Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And it was on Hantana Estate, but also nearby areas, which you might recognize in the film. I don't have time to go through all the different locations. So this was 2 months before Sri Lanka's deadliest anti-Tamil riots, also known as Black July. The riots would engulf the nearby town of Kandy, and where Kate Capshaw, Harrison Ford, and everyone stayed. They stayed in town at hotels, and the surrounding areas in flames, resulting in tens of thousands of Tamils being displaced across the island, but also being killed, tortured, and also disappeared. In February this year, I sat down with location supervisor credited in the film as production supervisor, Chandran Ratnam in Colombo. And I just want to kind of go through the mapping of where Northern Province is as well, and this kind of area. So I sat with them, and this is kind of Hantana Estate, and this is Chandran Ratnam, and with Steven Spielberg. And I asked him how the film had come to Sri Lanka, and he told me this: films do not just come to places, they have to be lassoed to places. I think that's pretty appropriate then. Spielberg and Lucas had begun to build the exteriors in Jaipur, India, in fact, but the government of India was making many demands around the script and its use of words and references, such as the Thuggy cult and the Maharaja. So when they complained to Ratnam about the rules, he suggested to bring the film to Sri Lanka. And they asked, "Do you have a gorge?" To which he replied, "Yes," not knowing exactly what a gorge was. And later, we would find that that gorge, we would see the fortuitous gorge in the final rope scene of the film. I'm so sorry if I'm ruining this film for you. So the site that we now know is as Victoria Dam, Sri Lanka's largest, tallest and largest hydroelectric power station that was being built under then President Jayawardena's Maveli development program. And regarding India's rules and issues with their script, Ratnam told them, "You can use any words you want here." The next condition for bringing Temple of Doom to Sri Lanka was that the film crew there would have to build the Indian village the film's art director, Alan Cassie, had wanted and envisioned. And last month, I sat down with film production designer and art director, 77-year-old Sunil Vijayaratna, who was in his 30s at the time and had been asked to construct the fictional village of Mayapur based on a photograph of a real village in India. This is his illustration. He made this for me before having our meeting, just like sketched it right before we had our interview, which I thought was very kind. And so he and his crew, right, built a mock version of this village in the capital of Colombo and showed it to them. And they decided to abandon their set, it passed the test, in India, and they transitioned the production to Sri Lanka. Now, as you may or may not know, the film's plot pivots on Indiana, the archaeologist, stumbling across Mayapur, this village in northern India, and it is barren of life. He learns that the film's villain, Molaram, has stolen the village's sacred stone, Sivalingam or Shankara, which, according to the story in the film, had been given to the village by Lord Shiva. Along with stealing the sacred stone, Molaram, the villain, has also captured the village's children, forcing them to work in the mines to search for the other two missing stones. The village's shaman, who is played by the late famous Sinhala actor D.R. Nanayakara, insists that Indiana journey to the nearby Pankot Palace to retrieve and return the stone. And Indiana agrees, partly out of moral necessity, when a young village child who, upon returning and escaping the mines, dies dramatically in his arms, but also because he is after, as we know the phrase, fortune and glory. In October 2020, I spoke with Ratnam, who described how they worked with Hantana's grounds. The plantation, he said, for Spielberg and him was a natural film set, complete with Jaws of the Jungle's vampire bats, the planter's wife snakes, mongoose, elephant walks, triumphant elephants, and so much more. He recounted to me, quote, "We shot the beautiful land like it was. We built the village around the greenery," end quote. Likewise, Vijayaratna this year shared how Hantana was the perfect film set because in one direction there was a huge mountain, while on the other side, large cliffs and a jungle. They did not have to level the ground much, and the only challenging part was that they had to shoot the last scenes, which are the more green scenes, first, and then dry up the village for the first part of the story, the barren part. So on a clean plot of land, about 25 locally hired Tamil estate workers and 20 of Vijayaratna's crew from Colombo constructed the village at the base of Hantana Mountain over 50 days before the shoot with the actors. It was complete with cracked mud exterior wood and tin sheet houses, some of them half houses, the way they were shooting, and palm leaf roofs. But it was not without specific parameters from the plantation management about the land and labor they were going to supply. First, as Vijayaratna recounted to me, the management instructed them that if they wanted to uproot any tea bush, they would have to pay the management 25 years of what that tea bush would have brought them in terms of profit. Given the stipulations, they decided to use the contact herbicide gramoxone to desiccate and defoliate the area over 12 hours. So they didn't uproot, but kind of sprayed it over the surface. And as Ratnam explained to me in 2020, the village had to be depicted as a dilapidated, demoralized situation, in his words. So when I asked Vijayaratna how much 25 years worth of tea was quoted to him, he couldn't really remember the exact amount, but he did say with a smile, quote, "In our country, it is not nice to pull out the root of a tea bush, and that after the film, we should have tea again, no?" So the second stipulation was that the manager said that any extras or hired laborers from the estates for clearing for the film or for the extra scenes from the plantations, of which there are about nearly 200 hired workers for a 5-day shoot and those 50 days, they were instructed to compensate them roughly 150 to 200 rupees a day, which was their current wage at the time. But he and his crew thought that for the work they were doing, the clearing of the land, the creation of the small road that Spielberg and the actors and crew had to use to move the cameras up to the base of the mountain, the moving of large rocks, and the carrying of wood from Candy Town because they couldn't use wood there. They had to use a timber company. It was not enough. So they decided to give them a midday meal so that they would, in their words, they were like, this made them very happy to work for them. But Hantana's estate workers did so much more than work arduously on the set. Their lives and homes literally feed the images that you see in this movie. In the second village scene, the characters of Harrison Ford, Kate Capshaw, and now Oscar winner Ke Kwan are greeted with plates of rice and curry. And Ford replies to the villagers in Sinhala, stuti, or thank you. When Kate Capshaw, Sinhala is not spoken in India, by the way. So when Kate Capshaw refuses to eat the food the villagers have prepared for her in character, Ford sternly tells her in front of them in English, in his character, that's more food than these people eat in a week. They're starving. But later I would learn that Hotel Swiss, the hotel catering the food props for the prop master, Celinda Pereira, hadn't brought the promised rice and curry prop on the second day of the shoot. And so Vijayaratna ran down to the estate workers' line rooms, to the workers that he knew, asking them if they had any rice ready for them in their homes. And so he found some with one worker in her home and another worker gave him some manjal, in Sinhala, kaha or turmeric powder. And he used that powder to mix with some water in the rice to give it that same yellow color it had had on the first day of shooting for continuity, and they placed it on the actors' plates. At the end of the film, Indiana victoriously tracks back to Mayapur, and the screen flashes for not just 1 second through 2 images. So this quickly, and it is a shot familiar to anyone who has visited Sri Lanka or knows Ceylon tea. And now it's familiar to maybe you as you've seen this army photo shoot on Sri Lanka's hills. But then the women disappear and they are gone before you can get a close enough look to their faces, on their faces. The screen then fills with throngs of hill country Tamil extras from Hantana, smiling and surrounding Indiana and his love interest for saving the day, in reference to what Alex said in the beginning. The camera is positioned and moves too quickly to linger on any one face, and apart from an occasional ayo, which is a common expression of shock and exclamation among Sri Lanka's Sinhala and Tamil speakers, it is hard to hear what they are saying, but they are there. I do not know their names. I do not know their descendants, and I have so many questions. Are these extras still living on Hantana? Or did they, just 2 months after the film crew packed up, also get chased out of their line rooms with others during Black July? Or did they, like so many other hill country Tamils, leave for Northern Province in search of new plots of land? Or were they killed, presumed missing, disappeared, or dead? The lands on which I stood on that summer in Hantana in 2019 no longer bore the signs of parched tea bushes or constructed huts, but only the face of the mountain and rooted tea bushes below them. This is an image from just last month. The museum structures and images of touristic consumption remain in the factory, and visitors would rather know about how tea is rolled and fermented rather than the names and lives of the workers who plucked the leaves. So I sat in the museum's library in 2019 and again this past February and took out book after book, searching for some piece of evidence of this plantation's secretive histories. And finally, on an uncatalogued, dusty shelf of unmarked ledgers, I found one book, a death register for Hantana's tea estate residents for 1934 to 1935. Coincidentally, it's the same period for which Temple of Doom is meant to take place in the film trilogy. Sitting with the dusty, torn register, I began reading the entries to learn about those hill country Tamils who had died there. Of the 48 entries that I read, more than half were children between the ages of not even 3 days to 3 years, and their causes of death were listed as infantile debility, sickly child since birth. Bearing witness to and returning their presence to their presences on these pages, I left the museum swimming in the plot's question marks. Who were these workers that cleared the lands for Temple of Doom's fortune and glory and prepared and boiled the rice for Indiana and his friends to eat? Were they the grandchildren of those mothers and fathers who lost children in 1935? Are their children now living on untitled plots in Northern Province? And did they too, alongside their parents, clear jungle to make it livable? Would the uncredited elderly Tamil woman moving into the foreground of that final 1-second scene amid the tea bushes have known their children and grandchildren? And does her spirit now linger and trouble those epic narratives that fill this plantation and the films you saw today? So in conclusion, to watch these feasting scenes at this moment during Sri Lanka's economic crisis brings out in me what Joy James calls the symbiosis of love and rage. Where we can, without being held to the market-driven metrics of the academy or the commodity market for that matter, to question and think. Each time I watch these films, I witness the material and speculative afterlives of Tamil plantation workers' labor histories, whose unsettled debts on the one hand are at the center of this ongoing political conflict and economic crisis, and whose unresolved political liberation and legacies of loss on the other hand are often perceived as painted, motionless backdrops to the country's Sinhala and Tamil nationalist film sets. Embracing James's love and rage breathes sense and life against and into those scenes with secret histories that must be heard. As Vijay Ratna shared with me in our interview this year, Ceylon's tea plantations are beloved, treasured sites of prestige, nostalgia, and success. These Hollywood films, in their epic ways, confirm that, but they also force us to love and witness the secretive, nourishing, and dissenting plots of the Hill Country Tamil's labor histories that challenge those very consumptive fantasies. Those that feed the mouths of Hollywood's stars, fill the line rooms of a rubber plantation with harbored bags of rice and tins of sardines in belts, and create a restored village from the herbicide browned ground with debts paid and children eating rather than dying. Without discipline or the market standards, I linger on each grain of rice, each Tamil word uttered, and each bat wing and carved rock, knowing that they were put in motion only to be put in place, and that my love and rage might unsettle them again. At the same time, knowing what we know about the plantation's tea for oil, the deadly floods, and leafy soldiers with their leafy rifles, I cannot help but replay the scenes from these films in my head as often part of what feels like being run through a sieve-like filtering of race, place, nation, and labor that keeps Sri Lanka's plantations sites of endless surplus and malleability. How do we make sense of ordinary minority workers' lives and lifetimes of work being slowly consumed by the state's scandalous appetites over and over again? In Eating the Other, Bell Hooks writes, those who plot and partake in such feasting scenes, quote, flirt with death to flaunt one's power, end quote. And her words help me process the Sri Lankan state's own pointy teeth that never seem to dull when it comes to consuming this Ceylon tea that is not human. So today, as the people's struggle continues in Sri Lanka, and as the country recognizes this year 200 years of plantation labor on the island, I am hungry for these feasting scripts to eat the greed of the ethnonationalist state from the inside. To witness that moment when the army's flirting with those who make the tea that is not human turns onto itself and eats its own elite power reserves instead of forcing its marginalized workers to pluck tea to pay back its unpayable debts. One day, perhaps that all-consuming thirst for tea will moisten the lichen and saturate the plantation soil beds that were sprayed brown for fortune and glory in 1983. So much that this Macwoods Hollywood sign that is now suspended and floating sideways on its perfectly manicured rows of bushes would slip down the hill and that it rests on and get swept away. And as those in Sri Lanka continue to demand justice and relief, I have a feeling that I am not alone in wanting to feed beyond these vistas of splendor, where time stands still, and to listen to these scenes with love and rage. And thank you so much, and hopefully we have time.
Thank you very much. We're open for questions.
Again, I'm really sorry if I ruined the films for you, but we can talk about them. You can love them and
Oh,
So I have a couple questions. It's a really wonderful presentation. You didn't use the word slavery, which is interesting because I hear so much about agricultural slavery in today's world. So I was wondering if you could comment on why you didn't use slavery. And the second question I have is, as someone who's seen tea pickers in China and coffee pickers in Latin America, I'm struck how few films actually show pickers. And I'm wondering, in today's sort of culture, we actually see fewer films where clearly the workers are kind of a lower caste, they're very marginalized. And I'm wondering if the film world has changed in a way to not depict that makes them invisible.
A great question. And so, yeah, and thank you. Yeah, for the word slavery, it's interesting and kind of referencing what Alex talked about. In the literatures, that word is used often by scholars, and particularly for women workers. The phrase was slaves of slaves. So it's kind of doing a track on the patriarchy and trying to capture a sense of what the exploitation was like. Now, in the context of the global plantation, technically it's not enslavement, it's waged labor, and indentured labor was also different in terms of the ways workers migrated through recruitment that was kin-based through villages in India, but also that they voluntarily migrated. And so that resettlement, but the seasonal component of the labor, it kind of departs from what enslavement and the kind of chattel slavery terms, or lack of terms were. So it's, so I'm careful with that use of words, but it's interesting now as people are thinking about rights-based kind of forms of now thinking about reparations, but also other ways, they use that word in Tamil, it's adime. They use that word to describe the conditions, but that word is still kind of very contested. So that's why I'm not choosing to use it, but it's there. And then I think, with the films and the pickers, now it kind of opened up a can of worms for me where I now want to look at a bunch of films that look at tea. Ramita Ray, who is a visual art historian and is doing this work in India, in Darjeeling and Assam and other places in Bollywood. And so I'm curious, and China would be really fascinating to think of the more global components of how people were selected and so forth. But I haven't looked, I've been looking kind of very locally in Sri Lanka, finding this kind of island, thinking about it as an island, but also within the region of South Asia. But the propaganda board of Song of Ceylon is very different from, let's say, just coming in this exploitation film, Jaws of the Jungle, which was made the same time period of Birth of a Nation and other exploitation films that you might see. So yeah, it's a good question.
I've got a couple questions myself. One pretty straightforward and one kind of abstract that you're free to pass on if it's just not a literature you're reading. The first is, really Tea and Solidarity, I'm simplifying too much, but it was about trying to develop new languages to actually, put center workers in different ways or lead to different political visions. And now I'm wondering, after you're really studying visual cues and so forth, if you are imagining trying to develop a different visual language to think about and depict plantations today yourself. I mean, maybe not as a filmmaker, but differently. But the other question I was going to ask, I was really struck, and maybe I'm reading Feasting a bit too literally, but I was really struck by these unending portraits of what I might call abundance, right? That there's just always so much and more to be taken. And I couldn't help but thinking of a trend in environmental humanities scholarship, which we've seen in this lecture series. We had Candice Fujikane speak about her wonderful book last year, which has been trying to push against ideas of scarcity. That around academia, around in political discussions, we're always worried about scarcity. We don't have enough. We need more, etc. And she says, Fujikane herself instead said, we need to develop a politics and an ethos of abundance. We have enough. We are full. That this can do the kinds of work to push back against overconsumption today. And it's transposing it to a different site, but just in a really abstract way. I was interested in how you're thinking about abundance versus scarcity, especially in these contexts when, kind of abundance is being wielded to all sorts of naturalizing political ends.
Yeah, that's a great question. And for the visual language question, I think, I'm interested in this partly from my own kind of experience of, with tourism and the tourism industry. And if you go to any tea packet that you might see in a Whole Foods or tea boutique, you see these images of women plucking tea. And so when I see it in something like an army calendar, I'm thinking about kind of, this slippery kind of the slippage that happens between a tourism industry that's attracting a different audience to an army calendar that's being kind of sent around. So where do we, to ministers and so forth. So where do we see that slipping happen between the tactics of militarization in visual cues to the tactics of tourism, which seem very kind of disparate, but actually in Sri Lanka, they're happening. Military owns a number of tourist places, as some of you know. So it's interesting, post-war, that kind of development was put forward as like the way to go. And the military controls much of the tourism industry. And so it's interesting to see those slippage of cues. And then at the same time, also acknowledging what people on the plantations think of their own homes as beautiful, as constructed, as theirs, as in Tamil, the word ur, like their place of home and origin. So it's interesting to think like, what are the visual cues we can use from others? And so if you want to look up, there's a Tamil rapper named Arevu who uses these visual cues in his music video, Enjoy Enchami, which kind of went viral. And the kind of thinking of, the claiming or reclaiming of these visual cues to think about liberation. And so when I read these films, I wasn't always reading them with the same kind of, love. I was reading them as a child, as like, that's just someone, a nameless person. But then when you start to see them over and over again, you actually kind of do see like small things. There's a roti pan, for instance, in the scene where Harrison Ford is taking that in the back. And Vijay Ratna had told me like that roti pan we took from the workers' homes. We took all the props from workers' homes to make a village. And it's an Indian village, ironically. So it's like, they're creating this Indian village, right, on a plantation where people were told previously by scholars, they had no they had no place, they're landless, no citizenship. So it's this kind of almost like trolling of visual cues through the making of this film that was not for Sri Lankans, because obviously when you speak like, Sinhala in a film, everyone knows it's Sinhala in Sri Lanka, but as they, people share in the film, they're like, Spielberg doesn't really care if it's Sinhala or not. It could be Hindi, it could be Sinhala. It's just some language being put out there. And so the Sinhala script is fascinating. The Tamil script in Planter's Wife is fascinating, and Elephant Walk. And these are scripts that people know, the things that people say and are used to. So it's like the visual is maybe not just the visual too, right? And I think like, to think about scarcity and abundance, especially in the economic crisis, as we think about people not having enough food to eat, the fact that, these smaller stories, these secret plots are that people had food in 1983, even at the time where in 1935, they had experienced starvation or debility and kids were dying, as we know in the archives. And so what do we make of that someone would be so generous as to give a film crew free food that a hotel had not shown up to do its work for? And I think that's also interesting. And like just speaking to people who are on the film, the generosity of people on the estate to like welcome them with open arms, this kind of inviting of fortune and glory, and the need to have that kind of feel. And people still know the film in Sri Lanka, especially now after the Oscars, and they talk really favorably about it. And they were like, okay, Kwan was so like amazing, and he was like 12 years old. It was his first film. So it's interesting to think of like being in a conversation and what abundance could be beyond the material. So like, what is scarcity?
We are at 1, so we should probably wrap up, but I'm sure Mythri could take more questions after if you have them or something.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, since there have been so many cultural framings of these issues, externally, I wanted to ask, like, I know about Enjoy Enjami, I really liked it. I wanted to ask, have there been any indigenous efforts at reframing these cultural narratives? And if so, what has that impact been like?
Yeah. It's a really good question. And I think, the word indigenous, just to speak from, which communities are speaking, these are workers who migrated from India. So they're considered now citizens, but from 1948 to 2003 were disenfranchised. So they did not have like simple things like an ID card during much of the war. And so it's interesting as, those narratives now speaking up, because, so the 150-year mark was very much dominated by the industry in 2017. So the industry was like, we've had 150 years of Salanti. At the centenary point, like the 100-year point, they also dominated. Like books came out and there are all these images of the glorious years of 100 years of tea. Interestingly, the 200-year mark is framed as plantation labor, and the industry has fell silent. And now we're seeing community-based organizations, people from the community speaking up. And there's going to be an exhibition in May, right around May 19th, which is the end of the war as well, an exhibition in multiple places and a bus exhibition that's going to all 24 districts that's just focused on labor. And that's what's interesting to see the actual marked shift of like creating a space where people are, designing the panels, the exhibits, donating their items to be in this bus, but also these other spaces to really think about, who gets to tell this story at this 200-year mark, as opposed to not having that same space at the 150 or 100. So there are a number of groups that do speak in the people struggle, but that happened last year on the green in the Capitol, but also more broadly. And so that's always heartening to see. And I guess for myself, I'm curious with these films, like what would it mean to like screen Temple of Doom or screen Elephant Walk and talk to people about their ancestors and what this means to be a part of this history.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.